Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll. This is our adult religious education class for comparative religion. We're currently discussing Buddhism, and this is the third of our lectures on Buddhism. I want to remind everyone that there's a course webpage, sites.google.com/view/comparative religion. And there you'll find links to the past lectures, videos, and links to additional reading, handouts, and anything like that I've done. So, what have we done so far? Buddhism, part 1, we talked about the introduction. This was back in May, so 2 months ago. We gave an introduction to Buddhism. We talked about kind of its size, its history, what countries it's predominant in, that sort of introductory material. And then we introduced the life of the Buddha, where we told kind of the traditional story of his life, how he lived, etc. And then I gave a sermon the next month, and I was looking for a topic, so I discussed the 3 marks of existence, which are 3 of the core Buddhist lists. It's among the lists that we'll discuss today. And so if you were already there and you saw that, I'll repeat some of that today, but this will have more of a scholastic approach, whereas the other had more of a devotional approach. And so it's not clear to me whether this is the second class or whether we count the sermon and this is the third. There it is. So in the introduction to the life of the Buddhist, we talked about how he was a prince who lived, in a palace, and he left to seek the source, the way out of suffering, and he became a traveling ascetic. And we talked about how that didn't go very well, how he tried to starve himself and fast and mortify his body to try to find a way out of suffering, and none of that worked, and eventually he meditated under a tree. And he claimed that he discovered enlightenment, or the way out of suffering. He then went and taught that to others. And we talked about some of the events of his life as he wandered and taught until his death. In the sermon, of course, I can't help myself. I used the Princess Bride as an example. And we talked about the 3 marks of existence, including life and suffering, and the nature of suffering, etc. And there's that great line from the Princess Bride: "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something." So that was what we discussed in the sermon. Again, from a bit of more of a devotional perspective. Today we're going to cover, from more of an intellectual perspective, the core of the teachings of Buddhism. In that sense, and then once we cover the teachings, there's a lot more still here. There's the Buddhist scriptures, where they came from, their history, what text sources we have. There's the different sects of Buddhism and how they split in their histories, etc., and what they disagree about, that sort of thing. We have Buddhist ritual and temples and buildings and architecture. And we also have meditation. We can talk about how to meditate, what meditation means to Buddhism. We have Buddhism today, including Western Buddhism and the influence Buddhism is having in the West. And in fact, the way the West has really created their own school of Buddhism that's in many ways unique. I have some recommended resources for the teachings of the Buddha, which is what we're going to cover today. Now again, if I go back to this, there's a lot of possible material for future classes. I'd love to talk to you about, after class sometime, maybe which of these things you want to cover. I mean, if we wanted, we could spend the rest of our lives doing Buddhism, but I think as a comparative religion course, we should probably move on and do some other things eventually. So come talk to me. Let's talk about which of these subjects are most interesting, and we'll decide what the next few lectures will be and how we'll kind of divide that up. So recommended resources, the teachings of Buddha. This is the best book for this material. It's called Heart of the Buddha's Teachings by Thich Nhat Hanh. At least I think it's the best that I've found in English, that has kind of an overview of the different traditional beliefs of Buddhism. In that sense, the list. We'll talk about the list in a minute. So this is my favorite. And I've seen a couple others, but most of them, I haven't seen one that's kind of as exhaustive as this, and yet is kind of helpful in showing you why you care and what it's all about. So this is my primary recommendation for this topic, for the topic for today's lecture. So what is it that Buddhists teach? When I did Christianity, we stopped and we had a lecture on, there was one on the life of Christ and there was one on Christian teachings. And then we did the same thing when we talked about Islam. And we always talk about what do religions teach. Religions are usually a set of beliefs, or a set of teachings. When we talk about what do people do, what do Muslims do, what do Jews do, what do Christians do. In this sense, we usually talk about orthodoxy, what do they believe, and then orthopraxy, what do they do. So what do Buddhists believe? And is Buddhism a belief system in the same way that most religions are? And in that sense, Buddhism is possibly unique, and it's a little different. So what's different about it? Well, I really enjoy Stephen Prothero. As you know, every single class I go to, I love Stephen Prothero's approach to this. So let's do it one more time. He likes to talk about religions and characterize what they are and what they believe by talking about what they think the problem of life is, because every religion says there's a problem. For example, in the one we're most familiar with, this might help you get the idea of what this is about. Christianity, the problem is sin. The solution is salvation. The technique is faith and repentance and possibly works, depending on the denomination, through the atonement of Jesus Christ. And then there's examples that you are to follow who show the way, Christ and the saints, etc. So, if you were to move to Hinduism, the problem isn't sin. Hindus don't even believe in sin. The problem is samsara, or rebirth, or reincarnation. Moksha, liberation from reincarnation, is the solution, and the techniques are various rituals, prayers, yogas, etc. And the examples are the avatars, the gurus, etc. So by doing that, you very quickly get a feel for how Hinduism differs from Christianity. Buddhism, the one we want to talk about today, if you do the same thing, it's very similar to Hinduism in that in traditional Buddhist teachings, they do believe in reincarnation, and they do believe that it's a problem, and the goal is to liberate yourself from reincarnation. But the bigger problem that the Buddhists see is suffering. Well, reincarnation wouldn't be a problem if we didn't suffer. And so in Buddhism, and this is what marks Buddhism as a different religion from Hinduism in many ways, there's a shift from the core problem of samsara to the core problem of suffering itself. We want to relieve suffering in this life, and the two are seen as sort of synonymous, because if you overcome suffering and become enlightened, you also won't be reborn, etc. But if you are, it's not a problem. You're going to be reborn possibly as a bodhisattva, which is this person who comes back to help others achieve enlightenment. And so, again, reincarnation is not quite the same problem it is in Hinduism, and the goal is to alleviate suffering in this life or in another, etc. So their focus is more on removing suffering than it is on just liberation in the Hinduist sense. And so the solution is enlightenment, and the technique is the Eightfold Path, which we will talk about today. And then you've got examples, Buddhists and Bodhisattvas. And you can do this with Jainism, Confucianism, Taoism, Yoruba, and even the New Atheists. So this is kind of the lists of how each of those kind of approach the world's problems. From the New Atheists who say the problem is religion itself, to the Confucianists who say that chaos is the problem, etc. Okay, so what is the teaching? In Buddhism we call it the Dharma. And Dharma is one of those complicated words that can have many different meanings. But primarily in what we're going to use it as today, it's the teachings. This is the teachings of the Buddha. So what is the Dharma? Well, the Buddha was, when he sat under the tree and achieved enlightenment, he had an experience. And this is going to be very important for everything we talk about. It's about an experience someone had. Not about teachings, primarily. It's about the experience. After he had the experience, he realized that part of his experience transcended words. It was beyond words. And so he actually, there's some Buddhist texts that record the Buddha questioning whether he should try to teach it at all. Whether it should just be his own personal experience and that's the end of it. But he realized that for him, he had found so much joy and happiness in his experience, he wanted to teach it to others. So he came up against the primary problem that all mystics have, and that is if what you're trying to convey is an experience, how do you use words to describe the indescribable? That which can't be described. So you can think of his experience as a river. And what he's looking for isn't a way to transmit the river. He can't transmit the river. You have to experience that for yourself. He's looking for a cup that can kind of convey the concept of the river to you. And so he'll give you the cup, and then you have to kind of get the river yourself. So he was looking for words that point in the right direction. In fact, one of the famous lines is, the teachings are the finger, they are not the moon. Now, that the finger is not the moon is a common Buddhist phrase, but it sounds like nonsense until you put it in its context. What it means is the teachings point. They are like a finger that say, look at the beautiful moon, and you point. And if someone stares at the finger, they will never see the moon. So the teachings in Buddhism are not the point of Buddhism. The teachings are the words that Buddha used to try to convey the path he followed in order to have an experience. But the goal of Buddhism is to give you that same experience. You're supposed to have the experience. The same experience that Buddha had. You're not supposed to just listen to the teachings and go, isn't that interesting? Now that's very hard to do in an intellectual kind of scholastic class. Because the point of a class is to use words to convey information, intellectual information. And so we're going to do our best to do that. But understand, Buddhism is not supposed to be about that intellectual information. We're going to stare at the finger today. But part of noticing what the finger is all about is recognizing that for Buddha, and for the Buddha, he constantly reminded people that the finger was not the point. It was just supposed to point at the moon. The moon is the issue, the point, what it's all about. He also described his teachings as a raft. The purpose of a raft is to take you to the other side of a river. The purpose of a raft is not to be a raft and just to carry it around with you everywhere. He says if you took a raft and used it to cross over to the other side, and then carried the raft with you on your back, you would not enjoy being on the other side, because you'd still be holding the raft. But he says, my teachings are not the other side. My teachings are the raft. Their purpose is to get you to the other side. Once you get to the other side, you can set the raft down. I think what the Buddha is trying to, or these teachings, these reported at least teachings of the Buddha, I think what he's trying to convey is, or to avoid, is this tendency that is found in lots of different religions, from Christianity to Islam, to turn their scriptures, their teachings, into an idol. An idol is something you worship instead of God. So, again, Buddhism is about achieving liberation, but Christianity is about worshiping God. In the same sense, the Christianity is supposed to bring you to God. God is the point, not the scriptural text. The scriptural text points at God. It is not God. And many certain fundamentalist sects have turned the Bible, I believe, into an idol. They worship the Bible, not the God of the people in the idol. The same thing happens in Islam and lots of different religions. This happens whenever people take their text and decide the text is the point, instead of the text being a finger that points at the point. What's really nice about Buddhism is that the text, the religious teachings themselves, contain the warning not to take the texts themselves as the point. And so that's a nice aspect of Buddhism. You know, I think it's true of all the religions that they would believe you shouldn't turn the text into an idol. But Buddhism, the text itself has this kind of warning not to turn itself into an idol. And this is the finger is not the moon, which is kind of a fundamental point of Buddhism. So as we teach the text, we should keep in mind that the finger is not the moon. This is also an important aspect of Buddhism because Buddhism has this element of pointing people at experiences rather than concepts. So Buddhists believe that concepts are imperfect and experience is the only thing that is real. Concept is, and if you, I tend to think about this from this perspective of a computer scientist, because that's what I do, right? from artificial intelligence or something. You can think of a concept as a model. A concept is a heuristic, it's a model, it's a symbol for something else. But the something else is the reality, not the model. And if you mistake the model for the reality, you will fall short of recognizing reality. That doesn't mean the models aren't useful. It means we have to recognize them as what they are, models, not reality. So, for example, think of this for just a second. This isn't the whole idea, but let's split it out in a way that's easy to think about. Let's talk about a sense, like your sense of taste or your sense of sight, versus the words we use for that sense. For example, describe to me the taste of salt. I have never had anyone successfully do that without saying it's salty. Because that's the only way you can describe it, right? It's salty. Well, if I've never tasted salt and don't know what salty is, what does that mean? We have the same problem of describing sound to a deaf person or describing color to a blind person. If you haven't experienced it, you don't know what those words mean or point to. The word salty is a symbol to point to an experience, but the experience is the reality. The word always falls short. It can only convey the reality to you because you've also tasted it. So I've tasted salt, you've tasted salt. I can therefore say salty, and you know what that is because you've experienced it. But the experience is the reality, not the word. Thich Nhat Hanh tells this wonderful story about walking through a forest with a little girl. And he was teaching a lesson, and he likes to do walking meditation with children to help teach them how to meditate. And this little girl saw a beautiful tree, and she said, "What color is that tree?" And what she meant was, I can see this color in this tree, but I don't know the right word for it. It's a color I've never quite experienced, like this tree in this picture. You know, it's got several colors, and is it green, is it brown? What is it? Is there a name for it? So she said to him, "Master, what color is the tree?" And he said to her, "It is the color you see." And then he explains in his book, the reason I said that is because I didn't want to add another concept. I was trying to teach the girl to be present in her own experience rather than lost in concepts, words, models, symbols that are not the reality itself in front of us. So, again, part of the reason that Buddhism functions so well with the idea the finger is not the moon is because they also have this core concept of experience versus discourse, words, concepts. This is a core teaching. So you notice when I talk about what do Muslims believe, what do Christians, what do Muslims believe, what do Christians believe, right? You usually start with, well, they believe in God, and they believe God did this, and they believe this book is the Word of God, and they believe Jesus came down and died, right? It's all about what happened. And I start talking about what do Buddhists believe, and the first thing I started talking about was they believe that concepts and experiences are different. It's very different. You see the kind of the almost the topical shift between those other religions and Buddhism. The topical shift is we're going to talk about what experience is like and what makes us suffer. And instead of here's God and here's the creation and here's the ark and the flood, and right, that's not the issue for them. Okay, so again, one other way of expressing this concept that concepts, and this is the problem, it's meta, right? How do you express the concept that concepts can't express reality? Because that is reality. You see the contradiction buried in there, and they're well aware of the contradiction, and they almost revel in it. So one of the ways to do that is a mandala, and mandalas have many meanings, and we'll have a whole discussion about them at a later date. But one of the meanings is this idea of the sacred center. Imagine that the center of this mandala is your experience. But you can't draw the center. How do you draw the center of something? Think about that for a minute. Well, you can't. Have you ever seen engineering drawings? I love that they put this little cross where the center goes. But the cross isn't the center. How do you draw the center? Say you put a dot at the center. Well, that's not the center because the dot has some size. The center is an infinitesimal point that every attempt to represent it has to have finite point and size, whereas the center itself is infinitely small. And they're aware of this concept. Now, I expressed it in a geometric idea, but they're aware of that idea as a philosophical concept. The experience is the center of the mandala, and you can't represent the center except by pointing at it, by drawing all the things around it. And so the mandala has all the stuff around the center that points you at the center. And by looking at the things around it, your eye is drawn to that center point. And this is another way to represent that idea that concepts and reality are not the same. Now, mandalas have many meanings. That's one of many. That's not the only thing a mandala is intended to represent. We'll talk about mandalas in greater detail later. So again, let's imagine you've had a mystical experience like the Buddhas. People have those sorts of things. It's not unreasonable. And you want to convey it because you want to help other people be happy. What do? You need a cup. Right? You need some cup that can transfer the water from me to you, that can get you to drink the water and taste it yourself. So how do I do? Well, the Buddha, I don't know whether the Buddha did this or whether his followers did. It's really not clear to me, how much of this goes back to a real historical person. Frankly, it doesn't matter. But Buddhism as a tradition does it with the numbered lists. Why numbered? Well, because you can memorize them. Number 1 is this, number 2 is this. You can talk about them. You can talk about the Fourfold Path. So the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. You can talk about them by referencing those names for the list, and people understand. So this is some people hate this, right? Because it seems like school memorization or something, right? You memorize all the 50 capitals of the 50 states, right? But other people love it because it's a good way to memorize them, but it's also a good way to practice. So for Buddhism, what I mean by practice is Buddhism attempts to remove suffering with mental exercises, among other things. And one of the mental exercises is to constantly remind yourself of what you're supposed to be doing, including what exercises, mental and otherwise, you're supposed to be doing. And so if you have these mental lists, you can constantly go through them in your head. You can go through the Eightfold Path, and you can list each of the elements of the Eightfold Path and say, am I doing that? Am I doing that? You can talk about the 2 truths. You can talk about the 5 mindfulness trainings and say, am I doing that? Am I doing that? You can talk about the 3 refuges, and you can think, as you think about each element of the list, you think about your life and say, am I doing that? And how does that relate to what's happening right now? And so in that sense, these are good mental floss, mental tools. You can think of them both as memorization techniques to convey the teaching from one generation to another, but also as a mental tool for practicing the techniques themselves. Whereas putting them in a list form is a good way to practice. That's one way of saying that. All right, so what are we going to talk about? The number of things that the Buddhists have in a list, you notice I've got 4 Noble Truths, Noble Eightfold Path, ... the 12 links of code arising at the end, and then ... I did that because there are more lists. There are a lot more. They just keep going and going and going, and you can spend the rest of your life studying them. And if I were to give you every kind of Buddhist list I can think of, we would be here from now till the end of time. So I had to pick and choose. And I kind of picked the ones I think are some of the most interesting. The first is the 4 Noble Truths. This is the core of Buddhist teaching. It's present in what's traditionally the first sermon the Buddha gave. After becoming enlightened, this is the concept he first taught to his friends. The Noble Eightfold Path is also core and key. I want to talk about the 2 truths because I find that to be incredibly interesting and fascinating. It's my own kind of personal fascination. And then the marks of existence and the seals we've already discussed in the sermon I gave. For those of you who didn't see the sermon, I'm going to go through them again. But again, it will be a different approach. I won't spend quite as much time on them, and it will be more of an intellectual exercise than a devotional exercise. But we'll talk about those again. And we'll end with the 3 jewels, because those are kind of a good summary and jumping off point for what to do next, I think. So let's go through just some of them. So the Four Noble Truths. The first is sometimes called the reality of suffering. Some people say all things are suffering. Depends on which tradition you look at. I find that to be overly pessimistic. I like this phrasing. That suffering is real. That you are suffering. You have to realize that you're sick before you decide you need it to be healed. I say the same thing in Christian traditions. We used to, in kind of my Sunday school years back when I was teaching religion as a kind of a fundamentalist believing Christian, we used to always say, you must teach the fall. And the reason you must teach the fall is because people need to know the problem before they will look for a solution. And the idea is that we are fallen, in Adam all die, therefore in Christ shall all be made alive. You have to realize there's a problem before you will realize that you need the solution. Well, in this case, you have to realize that you're suffering and that there's a problem, and that will motivate you to go out and find a solution. But if you're going to solve it, you need to understand, just like a doctor has to understand the causes of cancer before they can cure cancer, you have to understand the cause of suffering before you can remove it. And the cause is usually described, the tradition is, he says, the cause of suffering is desire. You can take that in a couple ways. I think that is overly simplistic because I can think of all sorts of other causes for suffering besides desire. Sometimes suffering is caused by other things. So maybe that's too simplistic, but it's also, I'm doing this poorly. Let me just start over. Why list desire and not something else? If there are other possible causes, or is he trying to say that's the only cause? There is another sutra, another teaching. Sutras are the kind of the collective discourse. The sutra is the discourse. There's another sutra where the Buddha lists many causes of suffering, and desire is the first in that list. So one possibility is that desire is used in the Sermon on the Four Noble Truths because it stands for that longer list. So I could go give you the list of all the things that cause suffering, and then we would have another one of our many numbered lists to go through. But again, we said we're not going to go through every numbered list in Buddhism. We just don't have time. But the other reason maybe he listed suffering isn't just because it stands for all the other, or desire, sorry, is the cause of suffering. It isn't because it stands for all the others, but maybe it's because it's the most important. And in what way is it the most important? So let's talk about how this works. How does desire cause suffering? Well, desire in this case means desire for things to be other than they are. And by that we don't mean looking up and saying, you know, it would be better if our nation had more social justice, so I'm going to go out and vote for someone who I believe will bring social justice. That's not what we're talking about. That's a desire for things to be other than they are. But it's a desire that recognizes things as they are, in the sense that part of the way things are is that we can go out and change them. To want things to be other than they are is to want to change things you can't change. In other words, I stub my toe, it hurts. I want my toe to not hurt, but it hurts. I can take medicine, but I want it to stop now, but medicine will make it stop in 5 minutes, so I want it to be other than it is. And again, this doesn't mean we don't take actions. It's not a nihilistic, I'm not going to take the medicine. It's that I recognize that it'll take a while for the medicine to kick in. My toe's going to hurt for a little while. That desire for things to be other than they are is what the Buddha thought was the cause of suffering. Let me give another example that might help. I remember when I was first learning to meditate, my feet would fall asleep. It was a constant thing. And I asked my teacher, what should I do? And he said, well, you can move to make your feet wake up, which is a good idea because you shouldn't torture yourself. But you can also look at the sensation of what happens when your feet falls asleep and just kind of watch it, because I bet it's not as bad as you think. And I did that. I sat and my foot fell asleep, and I noticed my mind was screaming at me, move, it's uncomfortable, stop, it hurts, I don't like it, I don't like it. And then I kind of looked at the raw sensation coming up my leg, and it was just kind of interesting. It wasn't actually bad. All of my suffering was coming from my mind telling me, you gotta move, you gotta change, you gotta do something. And very little of my suffering was actually coming from the sensations in my leg. Now, in this sense, we do have to separate pain from suffering. Pain is something that just happens. I mean, if you hurt, you hurt, right? But suffering is the extra hurt we add on top of the raw sensations by the way we react to them. And it's the mental models we create. And again, this is why Buddhism emphasizes this concept that experience is primary over concepts. And a large chunk of our suffering often comes from the concepts, not from the reality of the experience. And recognizing that was a core element in reducing my own suffering, and so it seems to be a core element in Buddhist teachings, because apparently Buddhists have also noticed that if you recognize this reality, you can reduce your suffering. So, suffering is real, it hurts, we won't make it go away. 2, the cause of suffering is wanting things to be other than they are, including wanting us to not suffer when we suffer. You see the circular meta problem, and again they recommend that. It's kind of contradictory. And then, it is possible to make suffering go away. This is the experience the Buddha had. He experienced liberation. He claims that his suffering went away. Therefore, he proposes that yours can too. And again, I don't think this means it didn't hurt anymore when the Buddha stubbed his toe. I think what they're trying to convey, whether he's a historical figure or not, by his mythical type as a person, what they're trying to convey is this idea that he stopped adding to his pain by the way he mentally reacted to the physical sensation of stubbing his toe. So there is a possible end to suffering. And that path that ends suffering is the Noble Eightfold Path. So, 4 noble truths: the reality of suffering, the causes of suffering, wanting things to be other than they are, the possible end of suffering, the Buddha did it, it can be done, and the path to end it being the Noble Eightfold Path. That's the 4 noble truths. It's the key of Buddhism, and it points at the next list. At the end of this list, it points at the next list, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. So, this is the proposed way out of suffering. If suffering can end, this is the way they claim you can end it. With right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Each of those things imply that there is also a wrong view, a wrong intention. So what do they mean by these things? Well, I believe that you can divide the Noble Eightfold Path into a Noble 3 path. Okay? You can have right wisdom, right action, and right meditation. This is the way I would describe it. Because right view and right intention have to do with wisdom. Right view is about seeing the world as it really is, recognizing the reality of suffering, the path out of suffering, recognizing that you are causing much of your own suffering. I guess I should have told this story. It's still one of my favorite stories. There was a dog walking down the street. And this is one of those stories attributed to the Buddha. And a child threw a rock at the dog. And the rock hit the dog, and then the child hid. And the dog turned around and barked at the rock. And then the point is, the dog is misattributing the cause of his suffering to the rock rather than to the boy. This is a parable. The rock is our circumstances. The pain of being hit by a rock is the suffering we feel. When we bark at our circumstances, we are misattributing the cause of our suffering to our circumstances, when the actual cause is in our desires. It's in us. It's not in what happens to us. I think that's really key, because as long as we think, I will be happy when I get the promotion, I will be happy when I get out of the job that I don't like, we're never happy, because when never comes. what we have to recognize is that we have the potential to be happy right now. Not that right now is perfect, not that nothing bad ever is happening to us, not that we don't want to get a better job if we can, not that we're going to work towards getting a better job, but we're going to be happy right now in the midst of the bad job. And if you think that's hard, we hear the stories of these Buddhist monks who went through intense suffering, who were tortured, who went through wars and things, and they talk about finding equanimity in the midst of the most horrible situations possible. And that's what they mean by the experience of what's happening to me is not the cause of my suffering. It might be cause of pain, like I stubbed my toe, but my suffering comes from the way I react to it. And I really can change the way I react to it. In a way, I can't change my circumstances. I mean, you can think of this as, from one perspective, it's almost victim blaming, so you don't like it. But from the other perspective, it's very empowering, because it means that something I can change is the cause of my suffering, rather than something I can't. Now, so if you look back at your own life and say, it's my own fault that I suffered, that might be closer to the victim-blaming approach. If you look at your current experience and say, I can change this way I'm reacting to what's happening to me, that's empowering. And so again, we have to be careful how we apply these concepts or they become dangerous. But this is right view and what right view is all about, recognizing the true cause of suffering, not barking at the rock, recognizing that suffering is coming from my own mental model of the event and working on that. Right intention is about wanting the right thing. So I haven't, in Buddhism, there's a lot you can learn about intention from meditation, and we'll talk about some of this later, but let's say I have the intention of sitting and concentrating on my breath for 5 minutes. 1 minute in, I'm distracted. You'll notice that my intention did not follow through to my actions. But the Buddhism recognizes that you first have to set your intentions correctly. And then you have to turn those intentions, those right intentions, into right actions. And the only way to do that is with practice, because we have this habit energy that takes us off in the wrong direction. We have to overcome our habit energy with practice. So first we set our intentions correct, and to do that we have to first set our views correct. So we recognize what's really happening, we decide that we want to change it, we set the intentions right, and then we move it into the realm of our actions, so that our actions then follow our intentions. In meditation, the easiest way to do that is mindfulness. As soon as I'm aware of the fact that I'm distracted and that that is not my intention, it's easy to bring my concentration back to my focus of breath. So mindfulness is a key to bringing our intentions and our actions back in focus, and you'll notice right mindfulness is on the list. And it's there because awareness of what we're doing is key to aligning our actions and our intentions. Another example, I have the intention of not yelling at my son even when he does really dumb things. He's a kid. He's going to do dumb things. He's going to break my screen door. He's going to spill the Cheerios. He's going to make a mess. That's what kids do. I would like to teach him not to do those things, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it would be better if I didn't yell at him, because when I yell, he shuts down. And I know, through my right view, that yelling is not effective. It's not an effective way of helping my son learn. So I have an intention, born of my right view, to not yell. Nevertheless, he spills the Cheerios and I yell. Mindfulness is that twitch moment when I go, oh, I'm yelling. Oh, that was not my intention. Oh, my right view told me that why that's not my intention. It's not an effective way of helping him learn. Oh, I should do something different. There is no guilt, there is no shame, there is no feeling, oh, I'm such a bad person. It's just recognizing what's happening. And the moment you recognize what's happening, you can fix it. And that leads to right action, namely right speech, right action, right livelihood. Those are all variations on right action. Right action being how you behave, and then he divided, apparently speech and livelihood are such important parts of actions that they merited their own element in the list, but they're really part of right action. We want to say the right things. We want to do the right things. We want to find a way to make our living that doesn't damage the environment, damage other people, etc. We want to support ourselves in a healthy way. Right speech, right action, right livelihood. So that I stop yelling at my child. We know that's not easy. So we have to develop right effort, because we have to try. We want to find a way to try without denigrating ourselves. Oh, I'm so stupid. Oh, I'm so bad. Oh, I'm not successful. Oh, I am such an evil person. Oh, I'm such a greedy person. That's not right effort. Right effort says, I notice that I'm wrong. I strive to do better. I correct my course. And I head off in the right direction without sort of shame or guilt or any of these things are considered unhelpful. So we just notice. That's mindfulness, which is the next element, right mindfulness and right concentration. Those things are practiced in meditation. So meditation is not considered necessarily an end in and of itself in Buddhism. Meditation is sometimes called practice because the goal is to practice the mental states we need to live our lives as our intentions say, because we know that our habits are going to lead us in the wrong direction. So let's say, go back to my example of yelling at my son. Often I would yell at my son, and the entire conversation will be over before I will realize that I didn't go very well. It usually didn't go very well when I noticed that he stops off to his room and we haven't accomplished anything. And I was like, that didn't go very well. Well, it would be nice if I noticed that sooner. So, what I do is I meditate. I find a nice place to sit, and I breathe. And I have an intention. I'm going to focus on my breath. I have an action. I sit and I focus on my breath. And then I have a distraction. I really have a lot of work to do today, and there's that one image I'm supposed to analyze, and I'm not quite done, and I wonder if I'm going to get it done. And my brain goes off on this distraction, doing its thing. Right? And then mindfulness kicks in. That pure moment of mindfulness where my brain says, wait, this is not my intention. And I bring it back to my breath. Now, I've already described that. But then I do it again. And 1 minute later, I'm distracted again. So I bring it back to my breath. And then I get mad at myself. Dang it, I suck at this. Why am I always distracted? And then I notice that that's happening. It's like, wait a minute. My intention is not to judge myself, just to practice bringing my breath back. So I bring it back. And I stop judging myself. Again, in noticing that I'm judging myself I don't have to do anything other than that for it to stop. It stops on its own. You just notice. I'm doing this thing, and it wasn't what I'm here to practice. Okay, back to my breath. And then I get distracted. And then I get judgy. And then I go back to my breath, and then I notice. And you sit and you practice. And so meditation is not just a way to achieve mental bliss by sitting and contemplating your navel. It's a way to practice noticing when your intentions misalign with your actions. And if you sit and you practice that over and over and over again, you'll notice something in your life, at least I did in mine, that the next time I'm yelling at my son because he spilled the Cheerios or broke the screen door or whatever he did wrong, I notice sooner because I've been practicing. And it's exactly the same thing that happens when I'm meditating. Oh, this is not my intention. Oh, this is not effective, my right view. I'm going to change my behavior. And in the middle of that conversation, it goes a different direction. And my son walks away having learned. And I walk away feeling better. And do you see how this leads to less suffering for everybody involved? So this is the Noble Eightfold Path. It includes right meditation, right action, and right wisdom. And they're all interconnected, and they all involve practice. That's what concentration is about. You concentrate as part of your practice, part of your meditation practice, to help you learn to concentrate on being mindful specifically. This is called right concentration, as opposed to what the Buddha saw as wrong concentration. Wrong concentration was the type of one-pointed concentration that he saw in Hinduism that he had learned earlier in his meditation practice, where you would have this moment of intense bliss. It's like being on drugs, and it feels so warm and fuzzy, and it feels so good, and you use that sort of concentration that creates that warm bliss as an escape from your life, instead of as practice to help your life get better. He would call that wrong concentration. So for in Buddhism, right concentration is the kind that we talked about with regard to practicing, as opposed to wrong concentration, which is this concentration that absorbs you into this blissful state that you can use as an escape. Now there are Buddhists, and there are various Buddhist traditions, who use that sort of concentration, blissful state, etc. But even there, they will always tell you that is not the point in and of itself, because attachment to even the blissful state of meditation will cause the same problems as that you're trying to avoid. Okay, so in fact, I think I should go back and say, you can remember when I said that conversation about desiring things to be other than they are. That's part of judging myself, right? I didn't follow my intention. I got distracted. I desire for things to be other than they are, and poof, I'm judging myself, and I'm mad at myself, and I'm angry, and that isn't bringing the peace I'm here to get. And just that itself doesn't match my intentions. There's a Christian way of saying this. There's a famous Christian prayer that I think gets at something very similar to what Buddhism is trying to teach. So I use it because it helps, I think, a Christian audience, or people in a Christian. When I say Christian audience, I don't mean that everyone here believes and is Christian. I mean someone who grew up in a Christian culture. So that way of saying it is, Lord, grant me the courage to change the things I can, the equanimity to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. For Buddhism, everything is wrapped up in that you can reframe Buddhism in that same terms, right? Right wisdom is the wisdom to know the difference. Right action is the courage to change the things I can and to act in the ways I can, and to accept the things I cannot, which is this idea of desiring things to be other than they are, specifically in that frame, the things I can't change. To have equanimity about those, to accept. So, Lord, grant me the courage to change the things I can, the equanimity to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's really the key to the Buddha's insight of how to remove his suffering. So, and you can see it in the Noble Eightfold Path and in the Four Noble Truths. So let's talk about the 3 marks of existence, the 3 universal truths, and the 3 Dharma seals. What is a mark of existence and what is a seal? Well, no. These slides are out of order. Let's talk about the 2 truths first, and then we'll go back. The 2 truths are what we call relative truth and absolute truth. And this has a lot to do with that idea of concepts versus experience. You can think of experience as absolute truth, and you can think of concepts as relative truth. But another way to think about this is, let's talk about desiring things to be other than they are for just a minute. What is the difference let's pretend we're all physicists because we're in Los Alamos, right? What is the difference from a physicist's perspective between a state that we don't want, a horrible state, and a state that we all want, a blissful state? What is the difference? It's a different arrangement of atoms. So you can think about what is in terms of a state space and a transition function, meaning atoms live in a certain space, and there's a transition function that makes them move from one state to the next, and they just kind of march down the state. And there is no such thing as good. There's no such thing as bad. There just is. Atoms are, they move as they are, and there is no difference between good, bad, happy, sad. That is absolute truth. Relative truth is something that happens from inside our own minds. In relative truth, there's me, there's you, there's a chair, and that chair is different than just atoms. That chair is a separate thing, right? And so you start to see separate things. in relative truth. And you can say true things about in relative truth terms. That chair is on top of that chair. That is a truth. But it's a relative truth. Because in absolute truths, there's just atoms. In relative truth terms, there is happy and sad. But in absolute truth, there is just atoms. That's one way of expressing the idea. This is a very convoluted and difficult concept to convey, and one I'm going to struggle to convey. So I'm going to point out that it's out there, but you can spend the rest of your life trying to understand exactly philosophically what they're getting at. But the other way to think about it is a wave. A wave versus water. A wave is relative truth. Water is absolute truth. You see, waves are born and they die, but the ocean is still there. In absolute truth, there is no difference between me and you, and there is therefore no birth, there is therefore no death, there is just atoms that move around. They temporarily come together, they make me, and they temporarily flow apart, and they make something else. And so there's nothing to be afraid of, there's no death. Right? And so this is a technique of looking at the world in this way that helps Buddhists develop the equanimity they want. Because when they want to make the world a better place and advocate for social justice or whatever it is they want to do, they think in relative terms and they go out and do what they're supposed to do. They change the things they can. And when they're faced with something they can't change, you can shift your mind's thinking to absolute truth and find a way to be okay with things as they are, and it can help. This way of looking at life and death helped when I was struggling with the death of my mother. I read a book by Thich Nhat Hanh specifically on dealing with death, and he talks a lot about absolute relative truth, and he talks about the fact that no one ever really dies because no one was ever really born. In that sense, reincarnation is true. It's kind of an objective scientific truth. Not because I was once the Queen of Sheba, but because the molecules that make up me once were in a tree, and before that they were in a star, and before that they were in the Big Bang, and before that they were in a singularity touching every other molecule in the universe all at once. And I'm part of those molecules, and they're part of me, and there is no separate me. And so there's no me to die, there's no me to be afraid. They're just molecules moving in the void, and we are all part of something bigger. And you see, this is absolute truth. And it's very hard to convey. And it's also hard to convey because when I try to talk about it with people, they will often see it as either nihilistic or as a path to not caring. If you think about the world that way, then why would you ever go out and try to make it better? So Buddhists are passive is the criticism that Buddhists will often get. You're passive because you don't care, you don't need to make the world better. You're so busy seeking equanimity that you don't bother to make things better. And again, I think that can be true, right? It all depends on how one approaches the teaching. If one focuses on absolute truth to the point that you don't go out and do something better in relative truth terms, that can happen. But if you focus on relative truth and ignore absolute truth, you'll be a basket case who will be filled with anxiety and troubles, and you'll be afraid of death, and when your friends die, you'll go crazy, right? So having both at the same time, and the problem is they're contradictory terms. It's very difficult to hold both views in mind at the same time, yet both are true. And this is this is why Buddhists like koans or other mental puzzles that have no solution, because what they're trying to tell you is that seeming contradictions are both true, they just depend on how you look at it. And those concepts themselves are the problem. And once you drop the concepts, you end up in absolute truth land, where concepts don't exist. All that is just your raw consciousness, the raw physical sensations, and the movement through time, where nothing changes, where nothing is permanent, etc. So, this is the idea of the two truths. And again, it's related to what we talked about earlier: concepts versus the experience. Okay, now we want to talk about the 3 marks of existence. Watch this for some slides being out of order. So these are called the 3 marks. Sometimes they're called the 3 seals. What is a mark and what is a seal? A seal is something you stamp to authenticate it, and a mark is something that is kind of left behind. by all things. All things leave their mark. And so when we call this list, you'll notice these lists are basically the same. The 3 marks of existence and the 3 seals are basically the same. But when you describe them as the 3 seals, what you're saying is these are the things that authenticate Buddhist teachings. In fact, they were written about that way by later Buddhist writers who are trying to say these teachings are authentically Buddhist, and you can tell that they were authentically taught by the Buddha because they have the seals in them. If they don't have the seals in them, they're not authentic Buddhist teachings. And then the 3 marks of existence is different. That, when you talk about it that way, you say, if you sit in meditation and look carefully at your experience, you will find that everything in existence is marked by these 3 attributes. This is fundamental aspect of reality. All elements of reality have these 3 things in it. So one is a statement about Buddhist teachings. The other is a statement about the nature of reality itself. And of course, if you're a Buddhist, you believe the Buddhist teachings mirror the actual reality. And so the 3 marks of reality are the same as the 3 marks of authentic Buddhist teachings. So here's what the lists are. And the problem is these are always called the 3 Dharma seals, the 3 seals of the teachings. But then you get different traditions who recorded the Buddhist teachings differently. And when you kind of put them together, you end up with 4, not 3. Each list will only have 3, but there'll be different lists from different traditions. And so when you try to combine all the lists, you end up with 4 things. So you have everything conditioned is impermanent. And by the way, almost everything is conditioned except the Big Bang. And so what that means is it's conditioned on, this is cause and effect. It's very philosophical. A lot of Buddhist teachings is not easy. This stuff is deep philosophy. It's like reading Greek philosophy. Learning Buddhist doctrine, to put a Christian term on it, is like reading Greek philosophy. And it's all tied together. So, the 3 Dharma seals, everything conditioned is impermanent. That means cause and effect. Anything that had a cause is impermanent. And that's a statement, again, they would say not of kind of dogma, not of belief to be just accepted on faith. It's an observation. Find something in the universe that has a cause that is permanent. It's a challenge. Do it. If you find one, let me know. It's been about 2,000 years and no one has ever found one. And so if it has a cause, it is impermanent, meaning it's going to change. Wishing impermanent things were permanent is the core desire that leads to suffering. We said wanting things to be other than they are. Well, the thing we most often want to be other than it is for the impermanent to be permanent. This is why we're afraid of death. This is why we don't like our neighbors to die, our cat to die, our dog to die, our friends to die, our lawn to die, our car to be damaged in a car accident. Right? We want things to stay the way they are when we like the way they are. We get very frustrated when they don't. The problem is nothing is permanent. So if we're to develop the equanimity to accept the things we cannot change, one of them is we have to accept that everything changes. And nothing is permanent, so we should stop wanting things to be permanent. In fact, if you actually spend the time to think about what it would mean to make something permanent, you probably wouldn't want it anyway. In fact, people don't want to grow old and die. I understand it. Your body grows old, and I hate the fact that my body is growing old and it's sore in ways it never was, and I can't run like I used to be able to. I don't like that, okay. So, do I really want permanence, though? If I were to freeze all of the kinetic motion of the atoms in my body, my consciousness itself would cease. Because consciousness is a function of change. Consciousness happens because atoms are moving and changing, and an electrical signal is changing in a dynamic sense. And if you were to freeze all that, it would go away. Consciousness requires impermanence. And that means your conscious experience itself is impermanent. If you ever meditate and you notice your current state of experience, that very act of noticing it will change it. It's almost like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? You can't observe it without changing it. Well, the same is true of our own experience. You can't observe your own experience without changing it, which is why as soon as I observe the fact that I'm yelling at my son, I stop yelling at my son. Because you can't observe your experience without changing it. Your experience is changing from second to second, atom to atom, moment to moment. Everything influenced by delusion is suffering and unsatisfactory, where delusion has to do with, wanting things to be other than they are, having wrong view, etc. All things are empty and selfless. There is no self. And then finally, nirvana is peace. That's the one that's usually left out. Depends on which list you're looking at. One or two will leave out all delusion as suffering and put nirvana as peace. You can actually put those as the same thing. Right? Delusion is suffering, therefore the lack of delusion is peace. And so maybe a better way to do this would be to call the three Dharma seals and just move that nirvana as peace up into the second one. And say you can either state it positively or negatively. Delusion is suffering, nirvana is peace. So everything conditioned is impermanent, delusion is suffering, nirvana is peace, and all things are empty, and by definition, therefore, selfless. Empty and selfless is also, empty means always empty of something. And so when a Buddhist will talk about emptiness, that's a very esoteric and bizarre phrasing, and it really threw me for a loop when I first started learning about this stuff, because I'd hear Buddhist teachers talk about emptiness, and I'd be like, what is this? It's like some weird mental state where you just kind of, you zone out into nirvana land and everything floats in emptiness. And that's not what they're talking about. Emptiness means empty of the self. Like a bowl is empty of water because it's got air in it, right? And so it's not that the bowl is empty of water or air. It's that when I talk about emptiness, it's empty of the self, which means we'll get to this. That's a really weird. Again, that is also a weird teaching. You'd think self is one of the things that we know we have. Okay, so those are the three seals. The three marks of existence are impermanence, suffering, and selflessness. You'll notice that these are basically, and then sometimes you get emptiness and joy. When you put these together, you'll notice they're basically the same list. Okay. How in the world does this help? Buddhism is an incredibly practical religion in the sense that it's not about what you believe, it's about making you feel better. You can almost think of it as psychology. These are therapists. The Buddha is a mental therapist, right? And so everything they teach is supposed to help. I mean, it's deep, complicated philosophy and stuff, but it's supposed to be practical. So how in the world does believing that you don't exist help? And isn't that just nihilistic? I have a friend who constantly calls Buddhism nihilistic, and we get in these arguments, right? And so isn't the belief that you don't exist just nihilism? Well, I'm going to be incredibly presumptuous, and I'm going to list my 4 marks of existence, and I'm going to go through them, and then I want to talk about how they help, make them practical. Now, one of the ways that they're marks of existence is that when you meditate, and we'll have a separate class on meditation, these are the things you're supposed to notice. And it's really easy to notice when you're meditating, for example, things like impermanence. I'm sitting there and I notice my breath, and the very fact that I notice it changes. And then I get distracted, and then I notice that I'm distracted, and the fact that I noticed it changes. And eventually, you'll start to get into what they call stream consciousness, where you, every millisecond, you feel something change. And you're just sitting there like sliding down a wet slide, one of those big water slides that you start at the top and you fall straight down. You feel yourself just falling through change. Because every moment is changing. And no 2 moments are the same. You're breathing in, and the sensation is rising and changing, and you stop and you hold it, and that changes. And you feel it change, and you start breathing out, and you feel it sliding, and no moment of the breath is the same. It's all impermanent. You can go through in meditation and notice the impermanence, the unsatisfactoriness, the interdependentness of everything, and the selflessness of everything, and that will help bring joy. Okay, how? Let's go through the practicalities. This is again Thich Nhat Hanh. And he says, it is not impermanence that makes us suffer. What makes us suffer is wanting things to be permanent when they are not. So, it's difficult to find a good order to convey this stuff in because it's a repeat. But I've already talked about how impermanence is actually essential for your own happiness and for your own existence. We don't actually want things to be permanent. We just think we do. My favorite example of this is we took my son to Disneyland. And he suffered greatly. And the reason he suffered is because we had to take him home afterwards. And he did not want to go. He wanted to stay there forever. And he said, so I want to stay here forever. I don't want to leave. Would you really want to spend the rest of your life in Disneyland? Would you really want to spend the rest of your life riding one ride at Disneyland? Would you really want to spend the rest of your life at one moment of one ride at Disneyland, stuck on the upswing of a loop, or do you want to come down off the other side of it? And then you want to go to the next ride, and then the next ride. And when you're done, are you tired and you want to go home and lay down in a nice bed, put the blanket over you, and feel, right? Impermanence is actually a path to joy. You don't actually want things to be permanent. And I'm going to give another example that is more difficult and perhaps more troubling for some people, but I hope you can take this in the sense it is offered. In 2000, I think it was 2009, my mother passed away, just as I was actually losing my faith in my older church. And I struggled greatly with it. I felt horrible. And I still miss her, and I believe that Buddhism has helped me deal with that greatly. But my old approach to death was to believe that the soul was permanent. And that meant I would see my mother again. Right? That all that had happened is I had been temporarily separated from her, and I would see her again in heaven, and we'd all live together forever. And I began to question that. Now, whether you believe that or not, that's fine, but I began to question it, and it hurt because that meant my loss of my mother seemed like it was something I couldn't recover from because I couldn't get her back. And I was talking to one of my Buddhist teachers about this issue, and he brought up the Disneyland thing because I had told him about my son in Disneyland. Came back, told him about Disneyland. Well, think about it for just a second. The only reason it hurts that my mother is gone is because it was so wonderful when she was there. And I didn't want that to end. But there's two things I can do. I can look at how wonderful it was, or I can dwell on the fact that I'm sad that it ended. I believe that we shouldn't feel bad because things are wonderful. My mother's presence in my life was a wonderful thing, not something to feel bad about. And it didn't last, and that's the nature of reality. And I can either be miserable now, or I can go out and have other wonderful experiences. Now that's where it gets hard, because you feel kind of like don't you feel it when you do that sort of thing? Like I'm not honoring her somehow if I don't sit and be sad. But does she really want me to be miserable? Or does she want me to go out and have other wonderful experiences? Shortly after my mother died, my father remarried. And my stepmother is one of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my life. She's great. If my mother hadn't died, I never would have met her. Does that mean I wanted? And this is where it becomes difficult, because I don't want to tell you that I wanted my mother to die, right? I didn't. I'm not telling you that I'm happy that she died. I'm telling you that each moment of life is precious. And each moment is impermanent. And I had one wonderful experience with my mother, and now I'm having another wonderful experience with my stepmother, Mary, and now I'm having another wonderful experience in this class right now with you. And to be here with you, I had to leave Utah and stop hanging out with my stepmother and my father. Every choice we make leads from one experience to another, and we have to, I believe, in order to remove suffering, I believe that we have to find a way to enjoy the moment we're in without agonizing over the moments we're not in, somehow. And I believe that that is the way the Buddhist teaching of impermanence has helped me reduce my suffering. So I said, how does it help? That's how it helped me. This is my experience, right? So it may not work for you. I mean, I no longer believe that everyone has to believe what I believe to be saved or to have their suffering end or whatever. If you found another way to make your suffering end, that's fine. But this is how this teaching helped me. Therefore, I don't see this teaching as the depressing thing it is sometimes portrayed as. Similarly with unsatisfactoriness, that sounds like, and it's sometimes phrased as all life is suffering, and I don't particularly like that phrasing, but I like the idea that all life is unsatisfactory. And how does that teaching how does it help? Well, if you think that things are satisfactory or will be satisfactory, you'll chase them. Right? And what happens is, if you think a car will make you happy, you chase the car. But the car is impermanent, and one of these days it's going to get in a car accident, and then you'll be sad when it's gone, right? We think that we'll be happy when we get the promotion. We think we'll be happy when. And there is a neurological point here that I think we all should understand. It's a biological kind of unfortunate truth. Evolution didn't care whether it created happy beings. And when it made our brains, its goal was to get us to do things that would help us survive and reproduce and raise our status, frankly, because then we're more likely to survive and reproduce and our offspring are more likely to do well, etc. So our brain tries to get us to do things. And that's what it cares about. It doesn't care if we're happy. Okay? What that means is the things we think will make us happy don't. They are unsatisfactory. And by unsatisfactory, I mean we think we will be happy when we get a car, a new promotion, etc. And that's our brain trying to get us to get a new car, a new promotion, etc. to further our biological evolution. But I care about being happy. So I go out and I get the new car, and as soon as I do, I have a small shot of dopamine, and I kind of think that's neat for about 5 minutes, and then I start thinking about what I should get next. And this is the constant accumulation of things or experiences. And there are people who travel the world doing the same thing, thinking, I will be happy, when I get to go to France or England. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't travel the world, right? But when we think that experiences or changing our situation or acquiring a new job will make us happy, we're barking at the rock. What we have to learn to do is to be happy now, whether or not we have the car, because the car is unsatisfactory. And if you notice this about your own mind, again, in meditation you said, you notice, oh my gosh, I think I'll be happy when I finally stop getting distracted. I went for 5 minutes without being distracted, and I wasn't even distracted long enough to be happy about it. Right? So you notice that your brain does these things to you when you meditate, and the more you meditate, the more you notice them. You think, I'll be happy when it's the weekend and I'm finally not at work anymore. And then it's the weekend and you're busy arguing with your son. And because you've learned to notice, you start noticing this stuff. And you're like, oh my gosh, I thought I would be happy when. And I'm not. It's all unsatisfactory because the brain will always try to get you to get the next thing. It's always interested in the next thing. That's how it's wired. And you start noticing that about yourself. And that is one of the marks of existence to notice, that your brain always wants something else. It's never happy with what it's got. It always wants something else. That's okay. You're crazy. You are bat guano crazy. So am I. So are you. So are every single one of us. The difference is, if you've experienced this, and I can tell you about it all day, but that won't create the habit energy you need. You have to experience it. When you start experiencing it and noticing it about yourself, you'll start to change. You'll still be chasing the next thing because that's what brains do, but you'll find a way to be happy in the moment instead of later. And you can leave here with the intention, I'm going to be happy now, because you realize that's stupid. I mean, it's not hard to realize that you're doing something dumb when you think you'll be happy later. You can be happy now, and then you can be happy later too. You can have the intention of doing that, but you won't do it unless you practice. So again, that's why Buddhism says these things are not dogmas. They're not teachings in that sense. They are observations that I can give you in a cup, but you have to make that observation for yourself and notice it in your own life. Because recognizing that it's intellectually true will make you think you should do something different, but you will go home and do whatever you've always been doing until you learn the art of noticing that it's happening in every moment of your life. And then again, just like my intention was to concentrate, I noticed I wasn't concentrating, now I'm back on my breath. The same thing happens here. I notice, oh my gosh, I'm doing the whole happy when thing. And you stop doing that and you start being happy right now. It works. But it requires that practice of noticing what's going on in your own brain every second so you can kind of bring it back. Okay, so that's unsatisfactory. This was a scientific study they did where they looked at people who did things like won the lottery or had a serious accident that caused them to be paralyzed. This on the bottom is an accident that left Olympic sprint cycling champion Christina Vogel at 27 paralyzed. And she wrote this big article about how she's still happy. Right? We think if we were to ever be paralyzed, we would be miserable. But people who have that experience very quickly find that their happiness goes basically back to where they were. Other people win the lottery. And they probably thought before they if I won the lottery, I would be so happy. And most of them are more miserable after than they were before. Because now they got all this extra stuff to worry about and their friends are coming to them trying to mooch money. Right? So what we think will make us happy won't. That's part of unsatisfactory, and that's also why we shouldn't collect stuff. Right? This is the hoarder syndrome. I'll be happy when I get this stuff, so I get all this stuff until my house is a mess and I'm not happy. Right? So the next mark of existence in my list is interdependence. This is one of those things that points you at the other form of truth, right? There's relative and absolute truth. Recognizing the interdependence of everything points you at absolute truth. Because you notice that there really aren't separate things. We like to think that the chair is separate from the floor, but it's not. We like to think the chair is separate from the rain, but it's not. Right? The chair was formed from the rain that fell on the floor, that was brought up into the tree. That everything is interdependent. Right? At one point, both the chair and I were in the forge of a star's furnace, being turned into certain molecules, and before that we were in the Big Bang. And right, well, we've said this before, but everything is interdependent. And a Buddhist way of saying it is, this is because that is. Now, I've seen all sorts of people like to compare Buddhism and quantum mechanics as if they're, finding some neat thing that no one knew before. And I think that doesn't do justice either to quantum mechanics or Buddhism. Because you're saying, oh, see, Buddhism is true. Quantum mechanics is rediscovered in ancient Buddhism. That's not true. Buddhism came to this conclusion because they were meditating and they noticed that things were interdependent. Quantum mechanics came to this conclusion because they threw light through double slits and noticed that weird things happen. But now that we know both, it's possible to make an analogy. So what I'm going to do is make an analogy. Quantum mechanics has shown that you can entangle particles. And frankly, probably a lot of the particles in the universe are actually entangled and interdependent, and it actually creates a different way of looking at the universe where everything is kind of connected. There's actually one Hilbert space function that's kind of moving through the universe, and it's all just one function, and all the particles are connected to it and tied to it. Everything is interdependent. And in a literal physical sense, that Buddhists never understood, I think, but the same is true of just our experience. Am I different than the tree? So I'm looking at it, there's a nice tree out the window over here. I'm looking at the tree. And this is the subject-object differentiation, right? I'm the subject and I'm looking at the object, the tree. But because I'm looking at the tree, something different is happening in my consciousness. Namely, I'm having a conscious experience of a tree. The tree changed my consciousness. If the tree wasn't there, I wouldn't have had that consciousness, and I would be using a different example for this entire conversation. But I am different because that tree was sitting outside of our window. As of right now, I'm a different person than I would have been if the tree wasn't there. Which means the tree and I are actually the same. Not the same thing, but we are interdependent. We're connected. You're connected to me. The thoughts going through your head right now are a function of what I'm saying. If I hadn't been saying these things, you would be thinking something different. So you and I are connected. If I was not here, you would not be who you are. You would be someone different. Because you'd be having a different thought. Interdependence. And then selflessness is actually a function of the others. For example, you are not the same person you were 5 minutes ago. You're impermanent. See, when we think it's not that the self doesn't exist. So this is the weird bit of Buddhism. You tell people that the self doesn't exist, and they're like, of course the self exists. Well, you can always define the self such that it exists if you want. What Buddhism is trying to say is that the self is not what you think it is. Because we feel like the self is this kind of permanent core, almost like a soul, that lives inside of us and is always the same, one moment to the next. But that's not true. Nothing is permanent. You aren't permanent, your thinking is different, and your thinking is interdependent. And we'll circle back on that in just a second. But it's not. I am not the same person I was when I was 5. That person is dead. And that person had to die for the person I am now to be born. Again, reincarnation is true in that sense. And the same is true that I will have to die for whoever I am going to be 10 years from now to be born. I have to die to make room for whoever that new person is going to be. We are not the same person from one moment to the next. We are impermanent. And when we think there's this core inside of us that is permanent and satisfactory, it's not really there. And we are going to die in the sense of stopping to be who we were. And that's very unsatisfactory to us. But we're also interdependent. As you would not be who you are without me, just as we just said a second ago. I would not be who I am without you. But you can also think of a chariot, right? Is the chariot its wheels? Is it the horses? Am I my finger? Or am I my toe? Or am I my nose? Or am I my brain? Am I the molecules of my brain? What happens when I eat a tuna sandwich and I switch out some of those molecules for different molecules? Am I now the tuna sandwich? You see, you are a conglomeration of pieces that came together like the pieces of this chariot, that each came from something else, each were influenced by something outside of it, and you came together for a brief moment to become a chariot, and then you will be taken apart to become something else. The idea of the chariot is a name. It's a concept. Now we're going to come all the way back to where we started. Remember that lecture, that discussion about the difference between the finger and the moon? Between concepts and reality? Between the word salt and the taste of salt? The idea here that Buddhism is proposing is that self is a concept, much like the word salt. It points at a reality, but it is not the reality itself. The reality is this impermanent, shifting, coming together, flying apart conglomeration of molecules. And the term we have for it in its current configuration is self. But that's just a term. It's just a concept. Worse, that concept does not match reality in many ways, and therefore leads to wrong view, and it leads to suffering. So how does it help to think that the self doesn't exist? Fear of death, desire for things to be permanent, all the stuff we've talked about before is wrapped up in this idea of the self. The self is a story. I am dumb. I am smart. I am cold. I am tired. I am bad. I am embarrassed. I went to a party and no one liked me. Those are all stories. And the stories we tell are often more important to our happiness than the reality of what's going on. And if we shift the story, and that is the miracle of cognitive behavioral therapy, if we shift the story, we often shift our happiness without ever shifting the event. We just have to shift the story. Buddhism goes the next step and says the story is an illusion anyway. And you're an illusion. All the way down to yourself, you are an illusion. And as soon as you realize that, you just start to live in this feeling and sensation that I've had once in a while. I can touch it and see what it's like, and then it slips away. But I can feel it. And it's that moment when you just kind of live in your sensations. In this moment, in this second, feeling these raw sensations without internalizing them as me or mine or I or you versus me. It all just kind of flows. That's the experience, the mystical experience that I believe the Buddha had, or that his followers have certainly had through the years, and they've spent and created this collection of teachings to try to describe it and help you feel it. This is the waves versus the water. This is the relative and absolute truth. When I was a Mormon, I went to the Missionary Training Center, where they tried to get me to sing, among other things, in the choir. And I remember singing in this choir with thousands of other Mormon missionaries about to go out and convert the world, right? That sensation is something that evolution has produced in us, among other reasons, to help us work in collective groups. It's part of our tribalism and our tribal nature. And it's a very powerful emotional and psychological experience if you've ever had it. And if you haven't, I'm sorry, go find something that will give it to you. You don't have to be a Mormon missionary to have it, but that experience is a beautiful thing. But what's happening in that experience, and people who go to war often will describe it too, right? The band of brothers fighting, evil, and they all give their lives for their brother. It's this sensation of losing yourself. The ego dies. And what's left is this very, very powerful emotional sensation where you feel connected to something larger than yourself. Carl Sagan used to try to create that feeling when he talked about how we were all stardust. And I've used that analogy myself several times today. But when he would make that analogy, they would play swelling music in the background, right? And the music the music would swell and it would grow, and they'd play, and they'd show this big star and it would blow up, and you were all stardust, and you feel connected to something larger than yourself. That's a very powerful experience, and when you feel that, your sense of self drops away. Well, Buddhism has a philosophical and meditative approach to creating the sensation that the self is an illusion. And when you have that realization, the self drops away and you have that same feeling. The same feeling you get as a Mormon missionary singing with thousands of other people. The same feeling you get when Carl Sagan does his whole "You're Stardust" thing. This is another approach to creating that kind of psychological sensation. So the result of all that can be joy, in this sense, the cessation or reduction of your suffering. Which begs the question, Buddhism claims it's possible to destroy all your suffering, to get rid of all of it, so you don't suffer anymore. I can't tell you that's true. In fact, I think it's not. Right? Even if you define suffering as different than pain, right? So a Buddha could still stub his toe and it would hurt, but he doesn't suffer because he doesn't add to it. I don't know if you can ever train your brain to never add to its own suffering by doing something stupid. Buddhism claims you can, and that's kind of an axiom of faith. And maybe it helps you pursue the path by thinking that it's possible. But I can tell you that you can reduce your suffering. And maybe, if I were to go on the path, maybe it's possible to get rid of all of it. I don't know, I'm not going to make anything, but I doubt it. But I can tell you the further you go down the set of Buddhist practices and teachings, usually, from my experience, the less my suffering becomes. So that's how it helps. How I believe the marks of existence help as a practical teaching. Now you notice every one of the teachings that Buddhism, that I've listed here, are not statements of faith. They're not statements of metaphysics. They're not even statements of, well, maybe they can be better, but they're not statements of theology even. They're not statements of dogma. They're observations that are supposed to be drawn from your actual lived experience. And if you don't think they're true, that's fine. Go do the experiment and see if you don't notice these realities in your meditation experience, right? And then notice whether your happiness improves. Go see. Buddhism extends the invitation of try it out. It's an experimental science. But it's an experimental science focused on your own subjective experience. So you have to figure it out for yourself. Right? You try these things, see if they work. And if they make you happy, great. If they don't make you happy, go do something else. Right? I don't need to convert you. I don't have to. I don't want to. But I can tell you it made me happier. And try it out for yourself and see if it makes you happier. And of all the religious traditions I've taught, from ancient Egypt through Mesopotamia, this is the first one where we asked the question, kind of, what do Buddhists believe? And the answer was a list of testable, experimental, objective experiments about what will happen to your own subjective experience. That it's very unlike anything else. Now, there are a set of supernatural beliefs that most Buddhists hold. So I haven't covered all of them here, but you can mention karma, reincarnation. Many of them will believe in gods. Many of them will pray to these gods. Those are things that Buddhists do and that Buddhists believe. But if you go to a Buddhist monk, for the most part, and ask them kind of, what are the core teachings of Buddhism? This is what they start talking about first. The Four Noble Truths are the core concept of Buddhism, and reincarnation isn't in there anywhere. God isn't in there anywhere. Prayer isn't in there anywhere. Suffering, the cause of suffering, the path to end suffering, that's in there. And then the rest is the path. And then the other stuff you can almost view as the environment in which the Buddha came to these psychological conclusions. He grew up in a world where people believed in gods and reincarnation, so obviously he did too. And his insight wasn't that all of his belief in gods and things was wrong. His insight was, oh my gosh, I can end my suffering. And he would tell people, according to the stories we have about him, I'm not here to teach those things. I'm here to teach suffering and the end of suffering. People would come to him and ask questions. Was the universe always here? Did it have a beginning? Is there a God? How many gods are there? And the Buddha would not answer their question. He said, you're here to learn how to end your suffering and you're wasting your time. Ask me a question that will help you lose your suffering and I'll answer that. So it's very clear that even though those other teachings are part of Buddhism, I didn't focus on them because the Buddha didn't. He didn't consider those other aspects of reincarnation, etc., to be important to the core of his message at all. They were just the background in which his main message was given. That doesn't mean they're not core to certain Buddhist believers, however. And we will talk about some of that next time because I want to talk about Buddhist practice. I want to talk about Buddhist temples and Buddhist prayer and the way Buddhists will pray to the Buddha and ask for. I want to cover all that because I don't want to sweep it under the rug. That's a very important aspect in thousands of people's lives, and we will cover it next time, I think, among maybe other things. It will eventually be covered, but the next time or the time after, I'm still working on that. So we're going to talk about it. I'm not going to sweep it under the rug, but I think if the Buddha was a real person, and if he was here, he would agree with me that, as interesting as that is, that was not the message that he taught, that he thought was important. This is. And so that's why we started here as the core of the Buddhist teachings, and we will do the other stuff later, which we will hopefully get to. So, the last of my lists, and I'm going to do this one in about 2 minutes. These are the 3 refuges. They're called the 3 refuges, or the 3 gems, the three gems. They have several different names. In fact, if someone, if Buddhism doesn't necessarily have rituals like baptism to convert to Buddhism. To become a Buddhist monk, or just to become a lay Buddhist disciple, you take the refuges, which means you say the following words: I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. So let's describe what those terms are. Buddha means the enlightened one. And it means the specific person of Gautama Buddha, but it also means the Buddha nature in you and in me. It means that we all have recognized the potential for enlightenment in each of us. We recognize that, and we take refuge in our potential to be enlightened and in the example we have, fictional or otherwise, of a person who was enlightened, and by that we mean who removed their suffering. So I take refuge in my power to remove my suffering, in the example of someone who did remove their suffering. I take refuge in that because what I'm trying to do is find a refuge from my suffering. So the three refuges are the refuge from your suffering. And that's the first, the Buddha. The next is the Dharma. We describe the Dharma as the teachings. I take refuge in the way out. I take refuge in the words that are these cups that convey the water. Again, I take refuge in those because I can come back to the teachings and they can help me. Now, it's not that the teachings are the water, but I take refuge in the teachings as a means to obtain freedom from suffering. And last, I take refuge in the Sangha. We haven't talked much about the Sangha, but the Sangha is the community. And I have a problem with the spiritual but not religious, which means I have a problem with a large percent of the population, because most, if you now kind of do surveys, you find that the spiritual but not religious are growing at an increasing rate, and there's an awful lot of them. And, they kind of feel that that's an enlightened position, because it means I'm spiritual and I have this connection to spirituality, but I don't go to church. Because churches are all these human organizations of foolish people. I don't want anything to do with that. Well, I have a problem with that. And my problem is we need each other. And we need community. And you know what? I might be an idiot, and I might step on your toes. And if you bother to be in community with me, I might be a jerk once in a while, because I'm not perfect. But I need you with me. Because if we're going to overcome our suffering, we need a community to do that with. We can't do it by ourselves. It doesn't work. Again, Thich Nhat Hanh has the story in the book I recommended for the additional reading for this class, The Heart of the Buddha's Teachings. He has a story about a person who was trying to quit smoking. And this isn't a judgment of smoking, this is just this person wanted to quit. And he couldn't. And he tried over and over and over again for years and could not quit. And he went to a Buddhist Sangha and spent several days there, and he quit. Why? Because he was around a bunch of people, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, who none of them smoked, and who all wanted to help him quit, because he said he wanted to quit. And it worked. Community is magic. And it requires us to be patient with each other. But community is magic. It really does change things. And when we strike out on our own and say we just don't need it anymore, we miss out. That's why I attend a Unitarian Universalist church. Even though I'm not sure if I believe in God, I come to church. What am I doing here? I like you guys. And you're not perfect, and you do dumb things, and you step on my toes once in a while, but I recognize that my spirituality requires the community. I can't be spiritual, but not religious, because religion is just spirituality with community on top. And so I am spiritual and I'm religious, because I need to take refuge in not just the Buddha and not just the Dharma, but the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And you are my Sangha. And so I take refuge in the example, in the teachings, and in the community. Now this is the first kind of topic where I am teaching something I believe in. I teach comparative religion. And for the most part, I teach these religions that I don't believe in, but they're interesting because they teach me something about my own nature as a human, and I talk about the reasons I care about religions, even religions I don't believe in. This is the first time I've taught a religion that I believe in. Not in a supernatural sense, but the philosophy is something I accept. And I hope that hasn't turned me too evangelical in my presentation thereof. If it has, I apologize, because again, that's not really the point of these comparative religion classes. But I hope that I've also conveyed them in a way, conveyed these lists of things in a way that is helping you understand Buddhist philosophy, whether you accept it or not. Understand what it's really trying to get at and what they're trying to accomplish, and how it might help somebody reduce suffering, which is supposedly its point. Okay, so that's today, the core teachings of Buddhism, specifically some of these lists. There's a lot of material for next time. Buddhist scripture, sex, ritual, temples, meditation, Buddhism today. So we've got a lot we could still do, and you're going to have to sit down with me and help me figure out which of these things you're most interested in learning about. And we'll have maybe 2 more classes on Buddhism, and then we really do need to go on, because I don't want to spend forever on this topic and not cover these other religions, just because, again, this is something I find particularly interesting. Yes, question then we're going to begin.
Well, this is for the future. I have an idea on a future religion that you could talk about, but we'll need to speak about that.
Yeah.
As for what I would be most interested in hearing about, I think that actually the supernatural element would be interesting to go into, because I'm curious to see how it has value to something that for a lot of people they don't look at that benefit.
I think that's really interesting too, because there's a whole story we can tell here about how the Buddha taught all this stuff about how to make yourself lose your suffering, and how that then, and then he created a sangha, a community, and then the community split and splintered and taught, and then how the teachings were conveyed and transmitted, and then how they started doing rituals, and how the rituals changed. And you can almost think of this like jnana yoga in the Hinduism class, and then bhakti style yoga took over after. And so if you don't know what that's about, go back to my Hinduism class lectures on that material. But something very similar happened to Buddhism. Like the core teachings about how to reduce your suffering are all about meditation, and it's hard, and it's this weird philosophy. And the layperson's like, man, I don't care. I just need something to pray to, right? And you get these people that try to achieve the end of their suffering through devotion. And I really shouldn't poo-poo that, because that is a powerful path to suffering reduction. Devotion to something, whether it's devotion to the person of the Buddha or to the gods that they then believe in, whatever it is, that actually works too. And so a large sect of Buddhists shifted from all this meditation, philosophy stuff to devotion to various Buddhists and deities and prayers and stuff. And that's very interesting, and I think we ought to spend some time, at least some time, talking about all that history. Although that's obviously a part of the tradition I don't agree with or don't practice. It's worth discussing, and I think it's incredibly interesting, because it means even if you create this kind of Buddhism has been called what's the right term for this? It's effectively atheist.
A godless religion.
Yeah, so it's not that it's godless. There are gods in Buddhism.
That's crazy.
It's that your reduction of suffering has nothing to do with them. They're just ancillary, right? They just kind of hang out, and so that's how they moved. How this moved from this kind of effective atheist religion to this devotional religion where people worship the gods. And again, Buddhism never denied that they existed, but people began worshiping them as one of their primary element of Buddhism. When Buddhism, as its core, I think was the opposite of that. That's a very interesting sort of story. So let's talk about that, at least among the things we discuss. All right, I'll see you next month, and we have the Biblical Scholarship and Literacy class where we're going to dive into the Exodus. And then we'll have one lecture on Buddhism next month, where we will probably cover kind of the texts and the sects and kind of how that moved down into ritual. Those first 3 elements are probably on this list, are a good topic for next month. So I'll see you next month, and I'll try to get the dates posted as soon as I can. Thank you all for coming.